In the chaos of war, legends are born not from glory, but from the darkest moments when everything seems lost. When death strikes the heart of leadership and panic spreads like wildfire through the ranks, it takes someone extraordinary to rise from the shadows. This is the story of how one man's precision with a rifle became the difference between total defeat and miraculous victory. It's about the moment when a quiet soldier stepped out of the background and into history, proving that heroes aren't always the ones wearing the captain's stripes. What happens when your leader falls and the enemy thinks they've won? Sometimes, that's exactly when the real battle begins. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Captain Michael Rodriguez checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation that always came before a mission. At 34, Rodriguez had led more operations than most soldiers twice his age, and his men trusted him completely. They called him the Rock, because nothing seemed to shake his confidence or his ability to make the right decisions under pressure. Sergeant James Mitchell sat quietly against a boulder, methodically cleaning his rifle for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. The other soldiers joked that Mitchell treated his weapon better than most people treated their children. But they all knew why. Mitchell wasn't just any soldier. He was arguably the best marksman in their unit, possibly in the entire region. His shooting skills had saved their lives, more times than anyone cared to count, but Mitchell never talked about his achievements. He preferred to stay in the background, letting others take the credit while he focused on what he did best. The mission briefing had been straightforward, at least on paper. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a terrorist leader responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, was holed up in a compound approximately 15 miles northeast of their current position. The plan was simple: get in, capture or eliminate the target, and get out before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Rodriguez had run similar operations dozens of times, and while they were never easy, this one seemed more manageable than most. What the intelligence reports hadn't mentioned, however, was the size of the enemy force waiting for them. As Rodriguez's 12-man squad moved through the mountain passes in the pre-dawn darkness, they had no way of knowing they were walking directly into the crosshairs of over 50 well-armed insurgents who had been preparing for this encounter for weeks. Mitchell had noticed something was off about 2 hours into their march. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the silence of the mountains felt wrong. Birds weren't singing, and the usual sounds of small animals moving through the brush were absent. It was as if the entire mountainside was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. He had mentioned his concerns to Rodriguez during one of their brief rest stops, but with no concrete evidence of danger, the captain had decided to continue with the mission. The squad consisted of some of the finest soldiers Mitchell had ever served with. There was Corporal Davis, a communications specialist who could maintain radio contact under the most challenging conditions. Private Thompson, barely 20 years old but already proving himself as one of the most reliable soldiers in the unit. Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran with 2 decades of experience who served as Rodriguez's right-hand man. Each member of the team had been carefully selected for this operation based on their skills, experience, and ability to work effectively under extreme pressure. As they approached the target compound, Rodriguez called for a final equipment check. Each soldier verified their ammunition count, radio functionality, and medical supplies. Mitchell took extra time with his rifle, ensuring that every component was functioning perfectly. His weapon was a custom-modified M24 sniper rifle that he had personally adjusted and calibrated over years of use. The rifle had never let him down, and he treated it with the respect of a craftsman caring for his most valuable tool. The compound sat on a small plateau surrounded by rocky outcrops that provided excellent cover for both attackers and defenders. Rodriguez studied the layout through his binoculars, identifying potential entry and exit routes, while Williams worked with the communications specialist to establish contact with their base camp. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan when Rodriguez gave the signal to begin their approach. Mitchell positioned himself on a ridge approximately 400 yards from the compound, a distance that allowed him to provide overwatch for his teammates while maintaining clear sight lines to multiple areas of the target zone. Through his scope, he could see Rodriguez and the other team members moving carefully toward the compound's main entrance. The buildings appeared quiet, with no visible signs of movement or activity. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when Mitchell spotted a glint of metal reflecting sunlight from a position that should have been empty according to their intelligence reports. As he adjusted his scope to get a better look, his blood ran cold. There were armed men positioned in multiple locations around the compound, and they were clearly waiting for Rodriguez's team to get closer before revealing themselves. Mitchell immediately reached for his radio to warn his captain about the trap, but before he could speak, The silence of the morning was shattered by the sound of automatic gunfire erupting from at least 6 different positions around the compound. Rodriguez and his men found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire with nowhere to run and very little cover to protect them from the intense barrage of enemy fire. Through his scope, Mitchell watched in horror as his teammates scrambled for whatever protection they could find among the rocks and sparse vegetation near the compound. Rodriguez was shouting orders and trying to coordinate a defensive response, but the enemy had chosen their positions well. Every time one of the soldiers tried to move to a better position, they were met with a fresh wave of gunfire that forced them back into inadequate cover. The enemy had clearly been planning this ambush for a considerable amount of time. They had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that made it nearly impossible for Rodriguez's team to advance or retreat safely. Worse yet, the insurgents seemed to have unlimited ammunition and showed no signs of letting up their assault. It was becoming clear that unless something changed dramatically, Rodriguez and his men were going to be overwhelmed. Mitchell knew he had to act quickly, but he also understood that revealing his position by firing would make him a target as well. From his elevated position, he could see enemy fighters that were hidden from his teammates below, but engaging them would require careful planning and precise shooting. One missed shot could give away his location and eliminate any advantage his team might have. As he watched the battle unfold below him, Mitchell began identifying priority targets among the enemy positions. There was a machine gun nest that was causing the most problems for his team. Positioned behind a low stone wall that provided excellent protection, while allowing the gunners to maintain a devastating rate of fire. Taking out that position would give Rodriguez and the others a chance to reorganize and possibly find better cover. Rodriguez was doing everything he could to keep his men alive and fighting, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. 2 soldiers had already been wounded, including Corporal Davis, whose radio equipment had been damaged by enemy fire. Without reliable communications, they couldn't call for backup or air support, and their ammunition was beginning to run low. The enemy seemed content to keep them pinned down and slowly wear them down rather than risk casualties in a direct assault. Mitchell watched as Rodriguez exposed himself to enemy fire while dragging Private Thompson to better cover behind a large boulder. The captain's leadership and courage were keeping his men fighting, but Mitchell could see that they were running out of options. The enemy had them completely surrounded, and their defensive position was becoming more precarious with each passing minute. It was then that Mitchell made a decision that would change the course of the battle and ultimately save the lives of his teammates. He would have to abandon his concealed position and engage multiple enemy targets in rapid succession, knowing that doing so would make him the primary focus of enemy attention. It was an incredibly risky decision, but Mitchell could see no alternative if he wanted to prevent a complete disaster. As he settled into his firing position and began calculating distances and wind conditions for his first shot, Mitchell felt the familiar calm that always came over him in moments of extreme stress. His breathing slowed, his heart rate decreased, and his focus narrowed to the crosshairs of his scope. Everything else faded away as he prepared to do what he had trained for his entire military career. Mitchell's first shot rang out across the mountainside like thunder, and the machine gunner who had been terrorizing Rodriguez's team dropped instantly. The precision of the shot was remarkable, a clean hit to the head from over 400 yards while the target was partially concealed behind stone barriers. The sudden silence from that position gave Rodriguez and his men their first moment of relief since the ambush began, but Mitchell knew this was only the beginning of what would be the most challenging shooting of his career. The enemy fighters immediately began searching for the source of the sniper fire, their weapons sweeping across the ridgeline where Mitchell was positioned. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they would identify his location and begin concentrating their fire on his position. In those crucial seconds, Mitchell had to make every shot count while also planning his next move to avoid being overwhelmed by return fire. His second target was another machine gun position located on the opposite side of the compound. This gunner had been firing in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining steady pressure on Rodriguez's team. Mitchell could see the muzzle flash clearly through his scope, and he calculated the trajectory needed to thread his bullet through a gap in the rocks that provided the enemy fighter's only vulnerable angle. The shot required Mitchell to compensate for both wind speed and the slight upward angle of his firing position. He held his breath, steadied his rifle against the rocky surface in front of him, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, controlled pressure that had become second nature after years of training and combat experience. The bullet traveled the distance in less than a second, and the second machine gun fell silent as its operator slumped forward over his weapon. Rodriguez immediately recognized the opportunity that Mitchell's shooting had created. He shouted orders to his men, directing them to advance toward better defensive positions, while the enemy was distracted and disorganized by the sudden loss of their heavy weapons. Staff Sergeant Williams led 3 soldiers in a flanking movement toward the left side of the compound, while Rodriguez and the remaining men provided covering fire. But the enemy was far from defeated, and they quickly adapted to the new threat. Several fighters began moving toward positions that would give them better angles to locate and engage Mitchell's position. Others maintained their fire on Rodriguez's team, preventing them from taking full advantage of the temporary reprieve that Mitchell had provided. The battle was far from over, and Mitchell could see that he would need to continue engaging targets if his teammates were going to survive. Mitchell's third shot targeted an enemy fighter who was attempting to set up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The weapon posed a serious threat to Rodriguez's team because it could destroy the limited cover they had found among the rocks. Mitchell could see the fighter struggling to load the weapon, while staying protected behind a concrete barrier. But there was a brief moment when the man's torso was exposed as he lifted the RPG to his shoulder. The shot was more challenging than the previous 2 because the target was moving and only partially visible. Mitchell had to time his shot perfectly to catch the fighter during the brief moment when he was vulnerable. He tracked the target's movement pattern for several seconds, noting the rhythm of his actions as he prepared to fire the RPG. When the moment came, Mitchell's bullet found its mark, and the enemy fighter collapsed backward, the unfired RPG falling harmlessly among the rocks. By this time, several enemy fighters had identified the general area where Mitchell was positioned, and they began concentrating their fire on his ridge. Bullets struck the rocks around him, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. Mitchell was forced to move from his original position, low-crawling along the ridge while carrying his rifle and essential equipment. The movement was exhausting and dangerous, but it was necessary if he wanted to continue providing support for his team. From his new position, Mitchell could see that Rodriguez's men had managed to advance to more defensible positions, but they were still significantly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Williams had successfully led his flanking group to a position where they could engage several enemy fighters from an unexpected angle, but they too were taking heavy fire and would need continued support if they were going to complete their mission. Mitchell identified his next target as an enemy fighter, who appeared to be coordinating the insurgents' defense. The man was using hand signals to direct other fighters to new positions, and Mitchell could see that eliminating this leader might disrupt the enemy's ability to maintain their coordinated attack. The target was approximately 500 yards away and positioned behind partial cover that made a clean shot extremely difficult. The shot required Mitchell to use a small gap between 2 rocks as his firing lane, threading the bullet through an opening barely larger than the projectile itself. Any miscalculation in windage or elevation would result in the bullet striking stone instead of its intended target. Mitchell studied the wind conditions carefully, noting how dust and debris moved across the battlefield, before making the minute adjustments to his scope that would give him the best chance of success. When Mitchell fired, he watched through his scope as the bullet traveled the distance and struck the enemy leader's center mass. The man dropped immediately, and Mitchell could see confusion spreading among the nearby fighters as they lost their tactical coordination. Several enemy fighters began falling back to more defensive positions, apparently uncertain about how to proceed without their leader's guidance. Rodriguez seized this opportunity to press his attack. He led his remaining men in a coordinated advance toward the compound's main building, where intelligence reports indicated their primary target was located. The enemy fighters were still dangerous and well-armed, but their resistance had become more disorganized and less effective since Mitchell had eliminated their key positions and leadership. However, as Rodriguez's team approached the main building, a new threat emerged from an unexpected direction. Mitchell spotted additional enemy fighters moving into position on the far side of the compound, apparently reserves who had been held back until the battle reached a critical point. These fresh fighters were better equipped than the others Mitchell had engaged, carrying more modern weapons and moving with the discipline of trained soldiers rather than irregular militia. Mitchell realized that he was running low on ammunition for his sniper rifle, having fired nearly half of his available rounds during the intense engagement. Each remaining shot would have to be carefully planned and perfectly executed if he wanted to continue supporting his teammates effectively. The pressure was immense, but Mitchell had trained for exactly this type of situation throughout his military career. His next target was the leader of the newly arrived enemy group, a man who was directing the fresh fighters to positions that would allow them to catch Rodriguez's team in another crossfire. Mitchell could see that if these enemy reinforcements were allowed to complete their deployment, Rodriguez and his men would find themselves in an even more desperate situation than they had faced at the beginning of the ambush. The shot was complicated by the fact that the target was moving quickly and unpredictably while using available cover to minimize his exposure. Mitchell had to anticipate where the enemy leader would be rather than simply shooting at where he was at any given moment. It required split-second timing and absolute confidence in his calculations of the target's movement pattern. Mitchell's bullet caught the enemy leader just as he emerged from behind cover to signal his men. The impact spun the man around and dropped him immediately, causing the fighters under his command to hesitate and lose momentum in their advance. Several of them retreated to more defensive positions, apparently unwilling to continue their attack without clear leadership. As the battle continued to evolve, Mitchell could see that Rodriguez was getting closer to completing the primary mission objective. The captain and his men were fighting their way through the compound's outer defenses, getting closer to the building where their target was reportedly hiding. But Mitchell also knew that the enemy still had significant numbers and firepower, and the outcome of the battle remained uncertain. What Mitchell didn't know was that in just a few minutes everything would change in ways that no one could have anticipated. The crack of the enemy sniper's rifle echoed across the mountainside like a death sentence. Mitchell watched in horror through his scope as Captain Rodriguez suddenly staggered and fell backward behind the rocky outcropping that had been providing him cover. The captain's body lay motionless, and even from his distant position Mitchell could see the dark stains spreading across Rodriguez's uniform. The man who had led them fearlessly into battle, who had kept his soldiers fighting against impossible odds, was down. Staff Sergeant Williams was the first to reach Rodriguez's position. Mitchell watched through his scope as Williams checked for vital signs, his face growing pale as he realized the severity of the captain's wounds. Williams immediately began calling for the medic, but Mitchell could see from the way the sergeant's shoulders slumped that it might already be too late. The leader who had held the team together through the intense firefight was gone, and the psychological impact on the remaining soldiers was immediate and devastating. Without Rodriguez's steady leadership, the team's coordinated advance began to fall apart. Private Thompson, who had been following closely behind the captain, froze in position, unable to process what had just happened. Other soldiers began looking around frantically, seeking direction from someone who could tell them what to do next. The enemy fighters, recognizing that something significant had occurred, increased their rate of fire and began advancing from multiple directions. Mitchell felt a cold rage building inside him as he realized that an enemy sniper had killed his captain. Through his scope, he began systematically scanning the areas where such a shot could have originated, looking for any sign of the hidden marksman who had changed the course of the battle with a single well-placed bullet. Finding and eliminating this sniper became Mitchell's immediate priority, both for tactical reasons and for the personal satisfaction of avenging Rodriguez's death. The enemy sniper had chosen his position well. Mitchell eventually spotted the barely visible muzzle of a rifle protruding from a concealed position nearly 600 yards away, hidden among rocks and vegetation that provided almost perfect camouflage. The position offered excellent sightlines to the area where Rodriguez had been operating, and Mitchell realized that the enemy marksman had probably been watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity to eliminate the American team's leader. Engaging this target would be the most challenging shot of Mitchell's career. The distance was at the very edge of his rifle's effective range, and the enemy sniper was positioned in a way that exposed only the smallest possible target area. Furthermore, Mitchell would have to make the shot while under pressure from other enemy fighters who were continuing to advance on his teammates' positions below. Williams had taken command of the team after Rodriguez's death, but Mitchell could see that the sergeant was struggling to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. Without the captain's calm leadership and tactical expertise, the soldiers were making defensive decisions based more on panic than strategy. They were burning through their remaining ammunition too quickly, and their positions were becoming increasingly vulnerable to the enemy's coordinated attacks. Mitchell knew that eliminating the enemy sniper was essential, but he also realized that his teammates needed immediate support if they were going to survive the next few minutes. Enemy fighters were advancing on Williams's position from two different directions, and the remaining American soldiers were in danger of being overrun. Mitchell would have to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, while also dealing with the threat posed by the hidden enemy marksman. His first priority was stopping the enemy fighters who were closest to overwhelming Williams' defensive position. Mitchell identified 3 targets who were advancing under cover of sustained automatic weapons fire from their companions. These fighters were carrying explosives and appeared intent on getting close enough to Williams' position to use them effectively. If they succeeded, the entire American team would be lost. Mitchell's first shot stopped the lead enemy fighter just as he was preparing to throw a grenade toward Williams' position. The bullet struck the man in the chest, spinning him around and causing the grenade to fall among his own companions. The explosion that followed eliminated 2 additional enemy fighters and disrupted the coordination of the advancing group, giving Williams and his men precious time to reorganize their defense. But even as Mitchell was engaging these immediate threats, he could see the enemy sniper adjusting his position, apparently preparing for another shot at the American team. Mitchell realized that he was in a deadly race against time. He had to eliminate the enemy marksman before the sniper could kill another member of his team. The pressure was enormous, but Mitchell forced himself to remain calm and focused as he prepared for what might be the most important shot of his life. The enemy sniper's position required Mitchell to make several critical adjustments to his aiming point. The extreme distance meant that bullet drop would be significant, and the mountain wind conditions were constantly changing, affecting the projectile's flight path. Mitchell had to account for all of these variables while also dealing with the stress of knowing that his teammates' lives depended on his accuracy. Mitchell took several deep breaths, steadying his rifle and clearing his mind of all distractions. Through his scope, he could see just a small portion of the enemy sniper's profile, barely enough to provide a target. The shot would require absolute precision. There was no margin for error at this distance, and under these conditions. Mitchell made his final calculations, adjusted his aim point one last time, and began the slow, controlled trigger squeeze that would determine the outcome of the battle. The bullet left Mitchell's rifle and traveled through the mountain air for what seemed like an eternity. Mitchell watched through his scope as the projectile found its mark, striking the enemy sniper with devastating effect. The hidden marksman dropped immediately, his rifle fallen among the rocks where it would no longer pose a threat to Mitchell's teammates below. With the enemy sniper eliminated, Mitchell turned his attention back to supporting Williams and the rest of the team. The psychological impact of Rodriguez's death was still affecting the soldiers' performance, but Williams was beginning to establish some semblance of control over their defensive efforts. Mitchell could see that several enemy fighters had been eliminated during the chaotic fighting that followed the captain's death, but significant threats remained. Mitchell identified another priority target, an enemy fighter who was operating a portable mortar from a concealed position behind the compound's main building. The mortar posed a serious threat because it could be used to attack Williams' position indirectly, bypassing the cover that was protecting the American soldiers from direct fire weapons. Eliminating this threat would significantly improve his team's chances of survival. The shot required Mitchell to engage a target that was partially concealed behind concrete walls, with only brief opportunities to achieve a clear sight picture. Mitchell had to time his shot carefully, waiting for the enemy fighter to expose himself while loading or aiming the mortar. The patient approach paid off when Mitchell's bullet found its mark during one of these brief moments of vulnerability. As the battle continued, Mitchell began to realize that his accurate shooting was having a profound psychological effect on the enemy forces. The insurgents were becoming more cautious and less aggressive in their attacks, apparently aware that an extremely skilled marksman was supporting the American team. Several enemy fighters had abandoned their advanced positions and retreated to more defensive locations where they felt safer from Mitchell's long-range fire. This change in enemy behavior gave Williams the opportunity he needed to begin reorganizing his team's tactical approach. Instead of simply defending against enemy attacks, Williams began planning a coordinated movement that would allow his soldiers to advance toward completing their original mission objective. The building where their primary target was located remained under enemy control, but Mitchell's shooting had eliminated enough of the defending fighters to make an assault feasible. However, Mitchell was also becoming aware that his ammunition supply was running dangerously low. He had been forced to engage many more targets than originally anticipated, and each remaining round would have to be used with extreme care. The challenge was complicated by the fact that new enemy fighters continued to arrive at the battlefield, apparently called in as reinforcements to deal with the unexpected resistance they were encountering. Mitchell realized that the next phase of the battle would determine whether Rodriguez's death would be avenged and whether the mission could still be completed successfully. Everything would depend on his ability to provide continued precision support for Williams and the remaining team members as they attempted to complete what their captain had died trying to accomplish. Williams had managed to rally the remaining soldiers and was preparing for what everyone knew would be their final push toward the compound's main building. The mission objective, capturing or eliminating the high-value target, remained unchanged despite Rodriguez's death, but the tactical situation had become far more complicated. Enemy reinforcements continued to arrive, and Mitchell could see through his scope that the American team was still significantly outnumbered despite his successful elimination of multiple enemy fighters. From his elevated position, Mitchell had a clear view of the compound's main building, where intelligence reports indicated their target was hiding. The structure was a two-story concrete building with narrow windows and a flat roof that provided excellent defensive positions for enemy fighters. Mitchell could see several insurgents moving around inside the building, but identifying which one might be their primary objective was impossible from his current distance and angle. Williams had decided that a direct assault on the main building was their only remaining option. The sergeant knew that his team's ammunition was running low, and that staying in their current defensive positions would only delay the inevitable. If they were going to complete the mission and have any chance of surviving, they would need to take decisive action while they still had the firepower to do so. Mitchell watched as Williams organized his remaining soldiers into two assault groups. The first group, led by Williams himself, would approach the building's main entrance while providing suppressive fire to keep the defenders' heads down. The second group, consisting of 3 soldiers including the wounded Corporal Davis, would attempt to circle around to the building's rear entrance and attack from an unexpected direction. The plan was tactically sound, but Mitchell could see several problems that Williams might not have noticed from his ground-level perspective.
Enemy fighters were positioned in locations that would allow them to catch both assault groups in crossfire as they approached the building. Additionally, Mitchell had spotted what appeared to be an enemy commander directing the defense from a position on the building's roof, partially concealed behind a low concrete wall.
Mitchell realized that he would need to provide precision support for both assault groups simultaneously, eliminating specific threats at exactly the right moments to give Williams' men the best possible chance of success. The timing would be critical. Too early, and the enemy would have time to replace the eliminated fighters. Too late, and Williams' soldiers would be caught in deadly crossfire before they could reach their objectives. As Williams gave the signal for the assault to begin, Mitchell identified his first priority target, a machine gun position that commanded a clear field of fire across the main approach to the building. The enemy gunner was positioned behind sandbags near a ground floor window, and eliminating him would be essential if Williams' group was going to reach the building's entrance without taking heavy casualties. Mitchell's shot was perfectly timed, striking the machine gunner just as Williams' group began their advance across the open ground. The sudden silence from that position allowed the assault team to cover significant distance before other enemy fighters could adjust their defensive fire to compensate for the eliminated position. Williams and his men made it to within 30 yards of the building's entrance before encountering serious resistance. Meanwhile, the second assault group was approaching the building's rear entrance but had been spotted by enemy sentries who were directing other fighters to intercept them. Mitchell could see that Corporal Davis and his companions would soon find themselves trapped in the open with nowhere to take cover unless he could eliminate the fighters who were moving to block their advance. Mitchell's next shot targeted an enemy fighter who was attempting to set up a blocking position behind a pile of rubble near the building's rear corner. The bullet struck the target's center mass, dropping him immediately and creating confusion among the other enemy fighters who had been following his lead. This confusion gave Davis's group the opportunity they needed to reach the building and begin their assault on the rear entrance. But the most challenging target still remained, the enemy commander on the roof who was coordinating the building's defense. Mitchell could see this figure clearly through his scope, but the target was positioned in a way that made a clean shot extremely difficult. The commander was staying low behind his concrete barrier, exposing only small portions of his body for brief periods as he moved between different observation points. Williams' group had reached the building's main entrance and was attempting to breach the heavy wooden door while under fire from defenders inside. Mitchell could see that the assault was beginning to bog down as enemy fighters poured concentrated fire through the building's windows and doorway. Unless something changed quickly, Williams and his men would be forced to retreat or risk being overwhelmed by the superior numbers of defenders. Mitchell made a critical decision that would require him to take an enormous risk. Instead of continuing to engage individual enemy fighters from his current position, he would attempt to eliminate the enemy commander with an extremely long-range shot that was at the very limit of his rifle's capabilities. Success would likely break the enemy's coordinated resistance and allow Williams' assault to succeed.
Failure would mean that the enemy commander would continue directing an effective defense that would probably result in the death or capture of the remaining American soldiers.
The shot would be the most technically challenging of Mitchell's entire career.
The target was nearly 700 yards away, positioned at a significantly different elevation, and protected by partial cover that left only a minimal target area exposed. Furthermore, Mitchell would have to account for wind conditions that were constantly changing as air currents moved through the mountain valleys and around the compound's buildings. Mitchell spent several minutes carefully observing the enemy commander's movement patterns, noting the rhythm and timing of his exposures as he moved between observation points on the roof. The target appeared to be following a fairly predictable routine, spending approximately 15 seconds at each position before moving to the next. This pattern gave Mitchell a narrow window of opportunity, during which he might be able to achieve a clear shot. The wind conditions were particularly challenging because they were not consistent across the entire distance between Mitchell's position and the target. Mitchell could see dust and debris moving differently at various points along the bullet's projected flight path, indicating that the projectile would encounter multiple wind conditions during its journey to the target. Compensating for these variables would require Mitchell to make educated guesses based on his experience and training. Mitchell made his final calculations and adjustments, taking into account bullet drop, wind drift, and the target's movement pattern. He settled into his firing position and controlled his breathing, waiting for the perfect moment when all variables would align to give him the best possible chance of success. The pressure was enormous. He knew that this shot would likely determine the outcome of the entire mission. Through his scope, Mitchell watched as the enemy commander moved toward his next observation point. Mitchell began his trigger squeeze, timing the shot to coincide with the moment when the target would be most exposed. The rifle fired, and Mitchell watched the bullets fly through his scope, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether his teammates lived or died. The bullet struck the enemy commander with devastating accuracy, dropping him immediately behind the concrete barrier where he had thought he was safe. The psychological impact on the defending fighters was immediate and dramatic. Without their leaders' coordination and direction, the defense of the building began to collapse as individual fighters made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting or retreat to safer positions. Williams immediately recognized the opportunity that Mitchell's shot had created. He led his assault team through the building's main entrance while Davis's group simultaneously breached the rear door. The remaining enemy fighters, demoralized by the loss of their commander and caught between two advancing American forces, began surrendering or attempting to escape through windows and other exits. Within minutes, Williams had secured the building and located their primary target, exactly where intelligence reports had indicated he would be found. The high-value terrorist leader was captured alive, along with several important documents and electronic devices that would provide valuable intelligence for future operations. But even as the mission objective was achieved, Mitchell realized that their challenges were far from over. Enemy reinforcements were still arriving at the compound, and Williams' team would need to extract from the area before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The most dangerous phase of their operation was just beginning. The capture of the high-value target should have marked the end of their mission, but Mitchell could see through his scope that their troubles were far from over. Enemy vehicles were approaching the compound from multiple directions, kicking up dust clouds that were visible for miles across the desert terrain. Radio chatter that Corporal Davis was monitoring indicated that insurgent forces throughout the region were converging on their location, determined to prevent the American team from successfully extracting their prisoner. Williams had established a defensive perimeter around the main building while his soldiers searched for additional intelligence materials and prepared the captured terrorist leader for transport. The prisoner was a thin, bearded man in his 50s who carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to command and respect. Despite his capture, he showed no signs of fear or submission, suggesting that he believed his followers would mount a successful rescue operation. Mitchell remained in his overwatch position, continuing to provide security for the extraction operation while monitoring the approaching enemy reinforcements. His ammunition supply was now critically low. He had perhaps 6 rounds remaining for his sniper rifle, barely enough to engage the most critical threats. Every shot would have to count if he wanted to help his teammates make it home alive. The first enemy vehicles reached the compound's outer perimeter approximately 20 minutes after Williams had secured the building. Mitchell watched as truck-mounted machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers took positions around the area, clearly preparing for a sustained assault designed to overwhelm the American defensive positions through sheer firepower. The insurgents had learned from their earlier defeats and were now approaching the problem with overwhelming force rather than tactical finesse. Williams was coordinating with their base camp via radio, requesting immediate extraction support, but Mitchell could hear enough of the conversation to understand that helicopter support was still at least 30 minutes away. The weather conditions in the mountains were making flight operations difficult, and the nearest available aircraft were dealing with other emergencies across the region. Williams and his team would have to hold their position and survive whatever the enemy threw at them until help could arrive. Mitchell identified the most immediate threat as an enemy technical vehicle, a pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in its bed, that was positioning itself to attack Williams' defensive perimeter from an advantageous angle. The vehicle's crew was taking their time to establish a stable firing position, clearly intending to deliver sustained accurate fire that would make Williams' position untenable. Mitchell's shot disabled the technical vehicle by striking the gunner before he could bring his weapon into action. The bullet's impact caused the man to fall backward into the truck bed, and his weight triggered the machine gun, which fired wildly into the air before falling silent. The other crew members abandoned the vehicle and sought cover among the nearby rocks, eliminating that particular threat from the battle. But more enemy vehicles continued to arrive, and Mitchell could see that the insurgents were establishing positions that would allow them to maintain continuous fire on the building where Williams and his team were located. The enemy was no longer interested in recovering their captured leader alive. They seemed determined to eliminate the American soldiers, even if it meant sacrificing their own commander in the process. Williams made the difficult decision to abandon the building and attempt to move his team to a more defensible position, while they waited for extraction support. The building provided good protection from small arms fire, but it would become a death trap if the enemy brought up heavy weapons or explosives. Williams knew that mobility was their best defense against the superior numbers they were facing. The movement would be extremely dangerous because it would require Williams' team to cross open ground while carrying their prisoner and wounded soldiers. Mitchell would need to provide covering fire during the most vulnerable phases of their movement, but his remaining ammunition meant he could only engage the most critical threats. The margin for error was essentially zero. Mitchell watched as Williams organized his men for the movement. Davis would lead the way with 2 other soldiers, identifying and securing intermediate positions where the team could take cover if they came under heavy fire. Williams would follow with the prisoner and the wounded, while the remaining soldiers provided rear security to prevent the enemy from pursuing too closely. As Davis's group began their movement, Mitchell identified an enemy sniper who was attempting to set up a position that would command the route Williams planned to use.
This sniper represented an immediate threat to the extraction operation, because he would be able to engage Williams' team during their most vulnerable moments.
Mitchell's shot eliminated this threat before the enemy marksman could get his weapon into action. The enemy response to Williams's movement was immediate and intense. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, and Mitchell could see rocket-propelled grenades being fired toward the areas where Williams' soldiers were seeking cover. The insurgents were expending enormous amounts of ammunition in their attempt to prevent the American team from reaching a more defensible position. Mitchell was forced to prioritize his targets carefully, choosing to engage only those enemy fighters who posed the most immediate threat to his teammates' survival. His shot selection was influenced by his critically low ammunition supply and by his assessment of which targets would have the greatest impact on the overall tactical situation. Every bullet had to make a difference. Williams' team managed to reach an abandoned stone structure approximately 200 yards from the main compound. The building was partially destroyed but provided better defensive positions and multiple exit routes in case they needed to continue moving. Mitchell could see that the team had successfully established security positions around the structure, but they were still surrounded by enemy forces and under constant fire. Mitchell's radio crackled with Williams's voice requesting an ammunition and medical supply resupply. Several soldiers had been wounded during the movement and their ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Mitchell realized that he was probably in a better position to provide support than anyone else in the team, but reaching Williams's position would mean abandoning his overwatch role and descending into the middle of the firefight. The decision to leave his sniper position was one of the most difficult of Mitchell's career.
His elevated location provided excellent visibility and firing positions, but his teammates needed immediate support that only he could provide. Mitchell gathered his essential equipment and began moving down the mountainside toward Williams' position, knowing that the journey would expose him to enemy fire and eliminate his ability to provide long-range support. The movement down the mountain was harrowing. Enemy fighters spotted Mitchell almost immediately and began directing concentrated fire toward his position. Mitchell was forced to move in short rushes between available cover, using his knowledge of the terrain and his combat experience to minimize his exposure to enemy fire. Several bullets came close enough that he could hear them whining past his position. Mitchell reached Williams' defensive perimeter just as the enemy was preparing what appeared to be a final assault on their position. Insurgent fighters were gathering in large numbers around the stone structure, clearly planning to overwhelm the American defensive positions through sheer numbers. The captured terrorist leader was encouraging his followers via shouted commands, apparently believing that rescue was imminent. Williams immediately put Mitchell's rifle to good use, directing him to engage specific targets that were threatening the team's defensive perimeter. Mitchell's remaining ammunition was precious, but Williams knew that the sniper's accuracy could make the difference between survival and death for his remaining soldiers. The final phase of their ordeal was about to begin. Mitchell settled into a firing position within the stone structure and prepared for what he knew would be his final shots of the battle. In the distance, he could hear the sound of approaching helicopters. Extraction support was finally arriving. The question was whether Williams' team could survive long enough for help to reach them. Everything would depend on the next few minutes, and Mitchell knew that his rifle would play a crucial role in determining the outcome of their desperate situation. The sound of rotor blades grew louder, and Mitchell could see the enemy fighters becoming more aggressive as they realized that their opportunity to prevent the American extraction was rapidly disappearing. This final assault would determine whether Rodriguez's death had been in vain or whether his sacrifice had ultimately led to the successful completion of their mission. Mitchell prepared for the most important shooting of his life, knowing that everything depended on his ability to make every shot count when it mattered most.